I used to only grow main crop or late varieties of potatoes in one garden and grew early varieties in all the other gardens and growing spaces. But last year I decided to grow the main crop variety of potatoes that I've been growing for quite a while in all of the different gardens to see what would happen. It was quite interesting to see these same long season plants growing with different methods, which helped me to learn a fair amount about main crop potatoes and discover a few issues with the different gardening methods themselves. And I learned that I could grow a bigger yield of potatoes than I thought was possible. Variety selection is important, or picking the specific type of potato to grow, as it can make a big difference, and this is the same with growing all vegetables. I've been really pleased with the results of this main crop variety that I've been growing for a few years, and the people that developed or bred this variety did a great job. It's a fairly new variety that is quite resistant to blight, which is the most problematic disease issue around here. It doesn't seem to get a lot of scab, which can be a problematic issue with other varieties in our alkaline soil, and the slugs tend to leave the buried tubers alone. Most importantly, last year I discovered that it really can produce a huge amount if the potato plants are given the right conditions and enough space. I'm not sure if it's my favorite variety for eating, but it's definitely useful in the kitchen and it seems to store really well. There might be better varieties out there for providing lots of really good quality potatoes for eating from the autumn through to late spring, and it would be good to try a few more. But for now, this Connect variety does a really good job, at least in my context. We didn't have a good growing season last year, or at least a lot of people complained that we didn't have a proper summer. But the potato plants seem to have disagreed, as they grew really well in the generally cooler weather. Having good soil conditions, enough soil moisture, and lots of fertility helps, but the temperature also seemed to be warm enough for these plants to grow really well, even if the heat-loving plants and lots of people didn't get the warmer conditions that they would thrive in. Potatoes really are a great crop for the climate of Ireland, at least for producing bulk amounts of carbohydrates for us to eat. These potato plants grew a lot bigger than I expected, and I think it was because of a combination of a vigorous variety, good growing conditions, lots of fertility, and enough space to grow into. Apparently, the typical bed wasn't wide enough for the single row of these plants, and the stems and foliage grew out and overcrowded the crops in the adjacent bed. I had to take the time to push the long haulms of these plants back into their own bed to make sure that there was enough space for the other crops, and I probably damaged some of the stems in the process. But the bigger top part of the plants didn't consistently translate into really big growth of potatoes beneath the soil. I'm still digging some of these potatoes out of the ground, having left them in place over the winter, instead of digging them out in the autumn as I'm supposed to and storing them somewhere else. And this seemed to have worked out well, at least for this variety, as most of the tubers are still firm, in really good condition, and they were only just starting to sprout at the end of March. There was less slug damage and decay than I expected in most of the gardens, and I think the slightly drier conditions that we had over winter helped. Not harvesting the potatoes in the autumn and leaving them in the ground until we are ready to eat them turned out to be a fairly successful strategy, at least this time. And I think it really depends on the soil, the weather, and the variety of potato. Although there is a greater risk of more damage from slugs and other pests the longer I leave them in the ground, it seems that the ground might be a better place to store these potatoes if there's a chance that some of them might be rotting. I dug up a few tubers that had definitely decayed, possibly from blight, but the potatoes around them were mostly not damaged. If I dug them out and stored them in bags in my cellar, the decay of this one potato could easily spread to others, and I've lost a lot of stored potatoes like this. So, at least with this kind of decay, there may be less risk to just leaving them in the soil where they are spread out enough so that one rotten potato doesn't spoil the rest. In one of the gardens, I planted the seed potatoes in a furrow or trench partially filled with compost, rather than spreading the compost evenly over the bed. This places the fertility very close to the plant roots, which apparently can help reduce the amount of scab that forms on the potatoes. But because I was growing a variety that is quite resistant to this fungal infection of the skin of potatoes, I'm not sure if there was any real benefit to this band of compost method, except perhaps that it might be easier or more convenient. I didn't investigate things properly and I didn't take any video of it, but I did notice that the potatoes that were growing in the remains of this band of compost were in worse shape than the potatoes that were growing mostly in the surrounding soil. There was likely significantly greater biological activity and diversity in the remains of that band of compost, and I suspect that some of that biology would have impacted the potatoes growing in that part of the bed. In the no-dig garden, I used a different method, shallowly planting the seed potatoes just below the surface of the flat bed, which only had a layer of compost spread evenly on top. The potato plants were then earthed up by dumping additional compost at the base of the plants on several occasions to cover any developing tubers with a mound of compost. Because I left the potatoes in the ground longer after the foliage died back, rain washed away some of this compost mound, exposing some of the tubers to turn green. Birds also accelerated this process, digging out the potatoes, damaging some of them, and exposing more of them to the sun and frost. So if I'm going to use this particular no-dig approach again, I really need to harvest the potatoes earlier in the autumn and possibly add even more compost. When the potatoes develop under the ground, they push the soil out of the way to make space. And with a main crop like this, the developing potatoes add a significant volume to the soil of the bed. When the soil is fairly loose and the potatoes planted deeper, the space for each of the potatoes could be made by slightly compacting the soil around them. But in the no-dig garden that has never been dug, the soil is still quite firm, and with a shallow planting and the loose piles of lightweight compost on top, it makes sense that most of this expansion was upwards. This caused the potatoes deeper in the soil to push the ones on top further up, leading to more of the potatoes being exposed to the sun. With a lower yield, especially with early potatoes, this would not have been a big issue, but with a huge yield of this main crop, more of the potatoes were pushed through the compost mound. Even with the shallow planting, the mound of compost, and the rising of the overall bed, I still had to dig the potatoes out of this no-dig garden. I tried to do most of this excavation by hand to disturb the soil as little as possible, but a fair amount of the soil was still cultivated and turned over, as the potato variety that I planted seemed to send tubers quite deep in the soil. I've heard other growers talk about being able to pull the plants out of the ground with most of the tubers, and I think this is more possible with an early crop when the plant is still growing, as the swelling tubers will break up and loosen the soil a bit. But by leaving the potatoes in the ground for longer, the soil and compost likely consolidated again, requiring more effort and digging around to get the potatoes out of the ground. Digging out all of these potatoes from the different gardens, it was interesting to see places where the plants seemed to produce smaller potatoes, and other places where I was surprised at how many big potatoes I was pulling out of the ground. I generally treat the full bed with the same amount of the same type of compost, and equally spread whatever additional fertility I may be adding. It's possible that the base level of fertility within the soil could change along the length of the bed, and there could be an uneven competition within the row or from plants in the adjacent beds. There was also variable amounts of pest and disease damage, and not all the seed potatoes that I originally planted were the same size. This variability in yield and the possible causes is one of those interesting observations that's probably not going to lead to any conclusions. One specific part of this variability is that a few plants seem to produce a huge amount of small potatoes very close to the center of the plant instead of being spread out. This clustering seems to push the whole mass upwards towards the surface of the soil, uncovering a lot of the potatoes that turn green and inedible. It seemed that these few plants didn't produce potatoes at the end of longer stolons or underground stems, and instead most of them were produced on shorter stems right close to the center of the plant. I'm not sure why this happens, as all these plants are supposed to be identical clones of each other. Perhaps there was something in the soil, or damage to some of the earlier roots, or some other conditions that would cause the occasional plant to grow or behave differently. In the extensive garden, a lot of the plants sent out a few quite long horizontal stems or stolons, at the end of which the potatoes developed. Some of the potatoes were almost under the path, about 50 centimeters away from the center of the plant, which was further out than with the same plants in the other gardens. This meant that I had to start digging right at the edge of the bed to avoid stabbing too many of the potatoes, but I still damaged quite a few of them. I suspect the wider spacing of the plants in the row of this garden prompted each of the plants to spread their potatoes further out, at least compared to the same plants growing a little bit closer together in the other gardens. But it could also have been some other factor like fertility or different soil conditions. This garden, with more extensive planting, with wider spacing of 40 centimeters between the plants in the row, produced the greatest yield of potatoes. I dug more potatoes out of this 10-meter long bed than from the other similar sized beds in the other gardens, growing the same variety of potatoes that was planted at the same time. There was more space for each plant, so I would expect each plant to produce more, but I didn't expect it to have a higher overall yield per meter of bed compared to the more densely planted crop with 30 centimeters between the plants. A greater proportion of the potatoes were really big and well-shaped in this extensive garden, which seems to indicate that these plants got everything they needed, including enough space. The yield from this crop of potatoes from this one garden last year was bigger than any other crop of potatoes that I produced in the past. Even after I removed some of the damaged tubers, there was still about 4.4 kilograms of potatoes produced by each plant, and more than 100 kilograms in the 10-meter row. I would have been reasonably content with half of that. I am hesitant to translate this into kilograms per square meter or scale this to a larger area, as a single row of potato plants took over so much more space, including covering the adjacent beds. But in this context, where I'm exploring how people can grow more of their own food, there is a real benefit to being able to produce so much food from a single 10-meter long row. In the polyculture garden, the potato plants were growing among a range of other vegetables rather than in their own bed, and the individual potato plants didn't have to compete with other potato plants. With the long growing season for this main crop variety, other types of plants growing beside them might not have had so much impact or competition, especially when I didn't fully plant this garden. I was able to harvest 5.5 kilograms of good quality potatoes from one of these plants, plus another kilogram of damaged potatoes. So this individual plant produced 6.5 kilograms, which was more than I thought possible. Of course, this doesn't translate into how much could be produced if the plants are growing closer together, or how much each individual plant would produce if there is space to get the maximum yield over a larger area. But it did show me how much each of these potato plants could produce if they all had the space and resources they need. This was the first year growing the main crop variety of potatoes in most of these gardens. I was generally really impressed with how productive they could be, and I think a lot of that is due to the good weather conditions and a great variety, at least for this context. I was also intrigued that there was such significant difference between the gardens, and I think it's a lot more than just plant spacing. I have grown main crop potatoes before, including this really productive variety, but only in the simple garden, and the yields have never been this good, even with wider spacing. I suspect that the soil management practices in that particular garden just aren't good enough to grow a really great crop of potatoes. The soil of the extensive garden that produced the biggest crop had been dug over in the spring with lots of decent quality compost. I had also added a good amount of a balanced mix of concentrated fertility when the seed potatoes were planted, and side dressed again with more fertility halfway through the growing season. And properly earthing up the plants with soil provided additional protection for the developing tubers so that fewer of them were damaged or turned green. I think all of this helped, as well as plant spacing, and now I'm wondering if I can repeat this huge yield this year in the same garden using the same variety and methods. And with everything I learned last year, I'm also thinking of how I might be able to adjust the methods that I use in the other gardens, now that a new high bar of productivity has been set, at least for main crop potatoes.